welcome to this week's book club for Star Wars Most Wanted by Rae Carson. We're looking at this book 2 chapters at a time, breaking down the themes and happenings as we journey through one of my favorite Star Wars novels. So this week we're doing chapters 11 and 12. The total page count was a little bit shorter than it has been, but there's plenty happening. Picking up where we left off, Han, Qi'ra, and Sulu are talking to the droid Tool in the Foundry on Corellia, trying to figure out what's going on with the droid Gatra and what they should do with this mysterious data cube. And in these chapters, we finally get a lot of answers as to what's going on. At the beginning, Qi'ra is noting their really good luck, that they found Tool, no one has found them, they've been able to talk out of all these situations, and she comments to herself how she never has this kind of luck, but then corrects her thinking to go, I never have this kind of luck by myself. And I think this is a subtle moment. It's only a couple of sentences, if that, at the very beginning of the chapter, and isn't brought up again for the next 2 chapters. But I think it's a really important shift in Qi'ra's thinking, that she has spent this whole novel noting her differences with Han, that she's the planner and Han's the gut instinct guy, and that Han's the one who goes all on luck, and that she doesn't really want to depend on luck. And seeing that almost as this thing that Han has that she doesn't, and this thing that drives her crazy. But here we're starting to see her think about it less as a thing that Han has and more of a thing that this group could have, that maybe there is a strength in being together and working together. Qi'ra is somebody who is so individualistic in the story, and not necessarily out of selfishness or an inherent selfishness, but really more of a survival instinct kind of learned selfishness. This idea of, like, I have to keep myself alive, I have to take care of myself because people aren't going to take care of me. And now she's starting to be in the situation where these people are taking care of each other and realizing that, you know, sometimes it's luck and sometimes it's teamwork. A big central theme that's going on in this chapter is the idea of the droid Gatra. Now, the droid Gatra is not necessarily a big plot point of this book, other than they are one of the, groups that Han and Qi'ra and Sulu have to interact with, but the nature of who the droid Gatra are not necessarily key, or at least haven't been so far, but it is this theme that keeps coming back, of this idea of, are they terrorists, or are they fighting for their freedom? Are they haywire droids that are out of their programming and are just hurting people, or are they sentient beings just trying to be on the same level as everybody else? And so far we haven't really truly gotten an answer. Star Wars has always taught us that the freedom fighters are more correct than the oppressors. I mean, that's just the language of Star Wars. Never mind what goes out in the real world, never mind actual history. Star Wars, we started with the rebellion in 1977. Like, it is in the DNA of Star Wars that the underdog is the good guy. There's been very few, if any, cases in Star Wars storytelling where the people who have the advantage are the heroes of the story, except for maybe the prequel trilogy with the Jedi, but even then, the Jedi are not portrayed as perfect. They're portrayed as flawed individuals who have lost their way. So even the good guys, the heroes, the protagonists, are the ones in power. They're not using their power the way they say that they should be using their power, that they're going against their own beliefs. And that's part of what's... Anyway, to get into the prequel trilogy would be a whole different video. But, like, in Star Wars, we are programmed to not to put a pun on droids, to believe the underdog story. So if I'm being told that, the droids are freedom fighters, the Star Wars brain that I have goes, okay, that's probably what's going on. That's just a thing that happens in Star Wars. But then there's other little things that just seem suspect. Either things I've read in other Star Wars material that has led with the droid Gatra, and some pretty, eerie stuff that was in the Last Shot novel and stuff like that. Or things like Tool saying, Han got hurt taking care of the cube. The life of a few organics is worth it to help free his people. So is that a selfishness? Is that a bad stroke? Is that we're weighing our lives over someone else's and not actually equality? Or is that the nature of the beast when you're a freedom fighter and you have to stand against oppression that doesn't care about your life, that you have to understand that there's going to be losses? So is that just the necessary survival calculatedness of somebody trying to fight for freedom, or is that a bad sign? I mean, it's been almost 3 years since I read the book, so I as of right now in the story has not committed to anything one way or another. It's possible that it does at the end of the book, and I'm not remembering because I read this a while back. But I think it's interesting that this is this ongoing question of should they trust Toole or not. And then you have Qi'ra, who thinks it's interesting but really is more worried about her own survival. You have Sulo, who is convinced they're terrorists, which is interesting because he's also into the Force and not necessarily against Force things, but also from Imperial Coruscant. And so it's just like he's got a lot of things going on here and there, considering the Jedi were labeled terrorists basically in their final days by the Empire. It's just, there's an interesting exploration of perspectives around this issue that hasn't really been spelled out yet, and that's one of the things I really like about Most Wanted, is that it has all of these interconnecting themes that you see throughout Star Wars. It's easy to look at a book and go, it's a prequel to Solo, a Star Wars story. Solo is a solo film in of itself. It is just backgrounds for the saga films, so this is just background for the saga films. It's easy to think about it that way, and think, this isn't something as critically important to the overall Star Wars narrative as some of the other Star Wars novels may or may not have been. But I think that does this book a disservice. I think that does a disservice to anything Star Wars, because anytime it's something that is not one of the films, it's arguably filler anyway. If that bothers you, I don't get why you're reading Star Wars books to begin with, but that's a whole other conversation. What Most Wanted does is it talks about class structure, it talks about perspective and certain point of view, it talks about how people see the Force versus not seeing the Force, it talks about being alone versus being in a group, it talks about, what is the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter. These are things that are just foundational throughout all of Star Wars, and something that anything that is quintessentially Star Wars explores in some way. And even though this is backstory for a backstory movie, this is one of the most Star Wars books I have ever read, certainly in the new canon. I enjoy that, and I enjoy that it does it all without necessarily being hyper definitive. I think you can read this and say that the book feels one way more than another about things, but the point of the exploration isn't really that. The point is the exploration. The point is asking those questions and the conversation that the characters are having. The point is seeing how Qi'ra sees things versus how Han sees things versus how Sulo sees things, and the journey between the viewpoints. And that, at least how it feels right now, where we're at in the book, that the journey of seeing each other's viewpoints is more important to the book itself than the finality of where you end up on that. And I think and I don't think that's a statement to say that the book or the author doesn't have an opinion on those things, but that exploration and that conversation and that journey with each other is really important, and we need to be able to have that. And I don't know, I like that this book does that so effectively and hits all of these different points, and that's just my soapbox for the day. That's part of why I like this book so much. Getting out of the big mega stuff into character detail, I like that Qi'ra is struggling to know if she should believe Toole or not because of his vocal inflections or lack thereof, that she's so used to picking up on nonverbal cues from people. To have a character that doesn't really have those nonverbal cues kind of puts her at a disadvantage. She sees that Han really cares for Toole, that Han sees Toole as an individual person, regardless of how Han might see all droids. And then in the middle of all these character points, we learn what's going on. We have shields. Now, it's funny, when we started reading this book, I remembered so much of the beginning. I remembered, the two sides of the deal. I remembered the race to get to the tunnels. I remembered a lot of this, and then I kept, as we've been reading, I'm like, I can't remember what this book does for the rest of the book. And then we got to Toole's explanation of who the engineer was, and I remember, not all of it, but I remember now, and we have some really cool stuff ahead. Some really interesting Qi'ra moments are still ahead now that I've had the memory switch flipped. So we have shields for lightweight ships. The idea that you can put a shield on something smaller, that's always been a big thing about Imperial versus Rebellion ship-to-ship combat, is that TIE fighters didn't always have shields and that sort of thing. And so what's going on here is you would have something that would either make the Empire completely unstoppable, or it would make a pirate unit, because we don't have the rebellion involved here, as far as we know. It would make a piracy group able to go after even something like the Empire, or in the case of the droid Gatra, it would level up the playing field, which I thought was funny. He's trying to work on his idioms and can't quite get that one. You know, again, that goes into the perspective thing. If you don't trust the droid Gatra, you're like, them with shields sounds bad. And if you do trust them, it's like, this will help them because they'll have shields and that'll help. Now, earlier in this video series, I wondered if the engineer would be a tie to Krennic, if the plans would be a tie to the Death Star, just because that was a logical thing. Like I said, I had kind of forgotten where this book turned, and I was very wrong about that, because it's, like I said, I'm really excited now for where these chapters go. But now I'm wondering if the shield that they're talking about could actually be tied, and I don't know, I tried to do a quick check on Wikipedia and I wasn't finding anything, but it made me think of the TIE fighters that Thrawn was making in Rebels, that also get referenced in the Thrawn novels, the new Thrawn novels by Zahn, that have shields, and like that's a big part of them, that the TIE fighters with shields. So I wonder if there might be a connection there. I don't know. Some of you out there might know more about connections than I do, but that is one of the places my brain went to as I was reading this. But either way, the reason why all of this went down was the Kaldana crime syndicate wanted the cube, wanted the information, didn't want the droid Gatra to have it because they hate droids, and planned to either have their bid work or they were going to forcibly take the cube. This is what led into a lot of the discussion I talked about earlier in today's video, about whether or not the Gatra were considered terrorist organization or not, and just how different Han and Sulo saw things, because Han was kind of basing it around, like, the only member of the droid Gatra I know is Tool, and I like him, so they must be fine, and versus Sulo, who's like, I know all the stuff that I was told as a child. And through it all, we get another line from Qi'ra that I think is very telling, where she basically says, everyone gets stabbed in the back by everyone eventually. So much of these lines from Qi'ra just make me think of the end of Solo Star Wars story, and knowing where she and Han end up. Just, there's a lot of very subtle foreshadowing like lines going on like that throughout the book. But now they need to come up with a plan. They don't know what to do. They could give the cube back to Tool, but then Kaldana are still after them, White Worms are still mad at them, the Empire is going to find out about them anyway. They don't want to give the cube to the Kaldana. Doesn't solve their problem with White Worms, might make the droids mad at them, and the Kaldana are pirates, it might still hurt them. They don't want to give it to the Empire because they hate the Empire, so what are they to do? Qi'ra and Sulo both think that just giving the cube back to the engineer, the person who was trying to sell the cube in the first place, is the best thing to do. Then they can get credit to the White Worms for, like, salvaging the deal. Lady Proxima might welcome them back. The auction can happen again, and they haven't actually stolen the cube. That's Sulo's logic, is you haven't actually stolen the cube from anyone. Han doesn't want to do this, he just wants to give the cube back to his friend Tool because he trusts his friend Tool. Surprisingly enough, Tool is actually more okay, at least, with the idea of them giving it back to the engineer than not. Which makes some sense. The droid Gatra did put in the winning bid before, and maybe they'd be able to do so again, and it's at least keeping the cube out of the hands of their enemies for a little bit longer. Tool is certainly in a position to at least get the cube back forcibly from Han, Qi'ra, and Sulo. Even if Tool personally couldn't do it because he was still too weak, he could contact members of the droid Gatra and they could have taken it forcibly. So the fact that Tool's okay with doing the auction again makes me think that at least Tool is fine and the droid Gatra might not be super villainous out in the background, and we don't really get to know. I like that when Han's saying we should just give it back to the droid Gatra, Han says Gatra, and that's how Qi'ra knows he's serious. That's just a very, very Han Solo kind of move. But ultimately, Tool decides to help them, says he can get word out to the engineer, they can get to her, give the cube back. But the big thing is they'd have to go off-world, which is a big moment for Han, because Han has always wanted to go off-world. Then we get to Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is very short. They're running through the smelter. Stormtroopers show up. During this time, Han himself is contemplating how he feels about the droid Gatra, but he doesn't get a lot of time because they have to run from the stormtroopers. It's daring, they have to jump over all this molten stuff and everything, but when they eventually get caught by the stormtroopers, it turns out they're troopers who are still loyal to the engineer. She's somebody who fled the Empire, has been in hiding, but has kept some friends within. So this is actually the engineer reaching out to them. They did not have to get word to her. They get this message from her. We haven't seen it yet because they're going to go to a private place in order to listen to it away from prying ears, but they now know that they have the next step in what's about to happen. During all of this, Han is also contemplating how smuggling is the only honest living under the Empire, that people don't get paid enough in the factories like they used to, so now they actually have to do illegal things on the side, even though they're not trying to do things that are illegal. He wonders if giving the cube to the droids wouldn't be better, because they're like the only group that hasn't screwed something up on the planet. There's just a lot of dynamics going on here that I enjoyed. But like I said, chapter 12 was very short. It was mostly them being on the run and getting the next step forward in the plot. So, where we pick up next week will be chapters 13 and 14. We're going to see what the next wave of story in this novel is going to be, and it's going to be a lot of fun, I can tell you that much. But those are my thoughts. Let me know how you felt about these chapters in the comments, and if you're not already, please follow us on the socials, and I will talk to you guys next week.